So Think Different Tanya, it's all about exploring the book of Tanya, which teaches us how to think different than perhaps we would normally think. We're up to chapter 48. There are 53 chapters of Tanya, and we're up to chapter 48. So we are in the final stretch run. And the conversation, for those of you that have been with us in past sessions, the conversation in this section of Tanya is about developing healthy emotions toward God and toward all things spiritual. And the idea, the big idea is that it's one thing to do even when we don't feel like doing. And that represents a great act of self-control, or what we would call Kabbalas Ol, which means accepting the yoke of responsibility, even when we're not feeling it. So that's certainly a virtue. It's what the Jewish people said when God offered them the Torah, when the Jewish people said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we'll do, and then we'll question. So the first message was, we're in, we're going to follow, we're going to be obedient. So that certainly represents, a virtue on some level. But at the same time, the Alter Rebbe, the author of Tanya, says that it's good to have an emotional connection when doing a mitzvah, when serving God, because otherwise it means, in a sense, only our hands are serving God, or only our mouths are serving God. And for it to be a full experience, our hearts have to be in it as well. So we've been exploring how to develop emotions toward God, toward spirituality. And we've discussed different meditations and different ideas and basically different meditations. What we're up to and what we covered in the last two chapters is what he calls a very straightforward meditation. In fact, he says you don't have to meditate for a long time at all. It's a very straightforward approach to developing an instant love for God. So what is it? Where do we sign up? So he says, give me an example. So imagine, again, those of you that have been with us for past Tanya sessions, so you'll recognize what I'm about to say. For those of you that are joining us, or maybe didn't participate in the last few sessions. So this will help get everybody back on the same page. So he says, imagine you have a person who's in a very lowly state. He's down on his luck. He's penniless. He's living, in the language of the Alter Rebbe, he's living on a dung heap. I don't know if that's a thing, but that's the expression that he uses, right? He's living on a dung heap. Imagine. And then imagine a very terrible, very lowly state of existence for this guy. And then imagine the king comes to the dung heap and meets this fellow and extends a hand and schleps him out of the dung heap and takes him to the palace and cleans him up and gives him clothing and then brings him into his innermost chamber and there showers him with affection and love and hugs and kisses, the whole deal. And without getting into the particulars of why the king would do that, it doesn't really matter. The point is, right, that he says, can you imagine after the king shows this man such unconditional, unprovoked, maybe, I'm not going to say this, but one could say perhaps undeserved love. Can you imagine the type of love that this fellow would feel for the king after the king did so much for him? He would love the king. This would be he couldn't help, even, as the author says, even a heart of stone would melt in the face of such demonstrable love. The Alter Rebbe says God did the same for us when he took us out of Egypt. There we were in the pits, not the Pittsburgh, in the pits. We were in the lowest of the lowest spaces. We were in terrible slavery. We were quite literally headed to become a footnote in history, if that, just a slave people that vanished through history. And God went down to Egypt, took us out, rescued us, got us cleaned up, right, with fanfare, took us to his innermost palace, and gave us the Torah, which represents the hugs and the kisses. He says, when you meditate on that, on the Exodus, what God did for us, it should evoke an incredible love back to the one, to the King of all kings, who rescued us, just like in our human example. But then he took it a step further in the last chapter, chapter 47. And he says, a person might say to themselves, all right, the Exodus happened 3,300 years ago. So you tell me for 3,300 years, you want me to be in love with God not to minimize it, but it happened a long time ago. So you expect me to still be in love with God because of the Exodus? So the Alter Rebbe says, yes, but here's the explanation. We're meant to recall the Exodus every single day. And it's not because we're nostalgic, but rather because, as our sages say, we have to look at our own lives as if we have the opportunity and we have the calling and we have the tools to leave our own personal Egypt today. And this is where he introduces the concept of having a personal Egypt. Personal Egypt means, in Hebrew, the word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim can also mean constraints or limitations. Every single human being has a constraint, a limitation, or multiple constraints and limitations. We're all limited, stuck by something and in something, whether it's a box that someone else put us in, or most often it's a box that we put ourselves in. We find ourselves in a limitation. And the calling for every one of us, the divine calling is break out of your limitation, break out of your box, break out of your Mitzrayim, break out of your own personal Egypt. How do we do that? With the gift of Torah that God gave us shortly after the Exodus, again, 3,332 years ago. By utilizing the Torah, we have the opportunity to transport ourselves out of whatever we're stuck in and into a place of pure connection with God. Basically, we human beings are stuck in all sorts of things. I don't need to tell you what we're stuck in. You know yourself what we're stuck in or what you're stuck in. Everyone's stuck in something. But when we study Torah, when we do a mitzvah, we have the opportunity to move completely out of that space, of the dunghill, so to speak. And we have the opportunity to connect in the innermost chamber with hugs and kisses and love and affection with the King of all kings. And that's the gift that God gives us, the gift that keeps on giving, because it's a gift that we can enjoy every single day of our lives, to break out of our own mini Egypts, maybe not so many, our own personal Egypts every single day. In this way, we can feel love for God every single day, because every single day we have the opportunity to wake up, feel the Egypt, the Mitzrayim, the constraints, and recognize our ability to get out of that, to transport to a different reality of connection with God through Torah and mitzvot, and then be grateful to God for giving us this gift. So again, the meditation is quite simple. Meditation is, if we were in a lowly place and were rescued, right, with love, wouldn't we feel love? The answer is yes. All right, so that's happening today. We have the Torah, we have that opportunity. So all of that was chapter 46 and 47. Tonight we begin chapter 48. And in chapter 48, he talks about this notion of divine love, because again, that's what the core of this meditation. It's not really an elaborate meditation. It's a pretty straightforward thing. It's like a shock meditation. God loves you, right? Look at what God's doing for you. God loves you. You got, right? When you realize how much God loves you, you'll love God. You and I will love God. So chapter 48 continues this theme by talking about how much God really loves us and how much God really does for us on a consistent basis. To do this, in chapter 48, he talks about not the Exodus, not the giving of the Torah at Sinai, but the process of creation itself. How do we go from an infinite God, infinite divine light, to a finite reality? And that is the product of what's known in Kabbalah and what I wrote in the email. By the way, if you're not getting this Tanya email, let me know and I'll make sure to add you to the list. So this is what's known in Kabbalah as the Doctrine of Simpson. This is very important. Now, for those of you that have studied Kabbalah with me in other contexts, in other classes, or have studied Kabbalah on your own, so you're probably familiar with this word, Simpson. It's one of the most essential concepts in Kabbalah. If you're not yet familiar with Simpson, we're going to explore it tonight. Simpson means, in short, it means contraction. And what I mean by contraction is a lessening of, or a it's a lessening of. It means more of, like, in the context of light, when you screen the light and only allow a little bit of it shine through to the other side. So it's a constriction, a concealment, a contraction, right? A lessening of, in order to produce something more, something radically different. So without saying too much, because I really want to read it inside, this is kind of the intro to Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is essentially, how do you go from infinite light to finite reality? Here's the secret. It's by concealing the light again and again and again and again, filtering it down, 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 until it gets to a place where it is capable of producing a physical finite universe. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to start learning chapter 48 in Tanya together. Okay, here we go. This is, by the way, this is straight from Chabad.org, chapter 48 of Tanya in English. The way it works in this version that I shared my screen, that I'm sharing my screen with. So the way it works is that there are some paragraphs of explanation that are written in kind of plain English text. There's, of course, the Hebrew text, which is the original. And then there's the larger italicized text. And that is the translation. So I'm going to focus on that, the translation, because I'll kind of be doing my own commentary in between. I'm not necessarily going to read the commentary as written. I'm going to share with you some of my insights and explanations. Okay, here we go. So let's begin chapter 48. Contemplating, before we do that, hold on, before we do that, let me check in and make sure that everything so far makes sense. So far, so good? Yes? Yes? All right, awesome. Hi, Zaidi, good to see you. All right, so let's jump in. Let's jump back into chapter 48, sharing the screen. Contemplating the greatness of the blessed Ein Sof. Okay, what is Ein Sof? Ein Sof means the one without end. In other words, the infinite one. So contemplating the greatness of the blessed Ein Sof, the blessed infinite one, referring to God. So when you think about God, who's infinite, the thinking person will come to the realization that as his name indicates, so is he. In other words, just like the phrase Ein Sof indicates, that is what he is. In other words, there is no end or limit or finitude at all to the light and vitality that diffuse from his simple will. In other words, God is called in Kabbalah, God is called Ein Sof. So he's saying, what does Ein Sof mean? Think about the name. You don't need a lot of meditation to realize that Ein Sof, by definition, means the one who is without end, the one who is without limits, the one who is not finite, the one who is infinite. So just like God is infinite, right? So if God is infinite, that means that there is no limit to the energy, to the light that is produced from God. Let's continue. And which is united with his essence and being in perfect unity. And that means that God, being infinite, has an infinite degree of expression, and all expression of God is perfectly united with God, even as it's expressed. So let me give you an example. We're going to use the classic example in Kabbalah, which was mentioned, which you probably noticed, which is the notion of light. Now, light's a very important tool of conversation in Kabbalah, because light is a very unique property. The thing about light is that light can never separate from its source. The moment it separates from its source, it ceases to be. To explain, I have in my hand a bottle of water. Okay, this is a bottle of cucumber lime smart water. I think it's called smart water because whoever made it figured out how to make a lot of money selling water. So that was very smart. Anyway, I have here a bottle of smart water, right? And if I take this, perfect. If I take this bottle, open it up, take some liquid and pour it into this cup. Okay, so now I've taken from the source bottle, poured it into the cup. That's the container, that's the vessel. And this is no longer needed for this to exist, correct? I no longer need this bottle for the water to exist. The water exists on its own. It's separate. It was together as one unit, and now it's distinct. There's water in the bottle, less water than before, and now there's water in the cup. When it comes to light, light is fundamentally different because although there's also a source and an emanation, source, emanation, the two are intertwined so tightly to the point that you cannot separate one from the other. So, simple experiment. If you're in a room and the light's on, like in this room that I'm in right now, and the room that you're in, right? If there's a room with the light on and it's light in the room because the light's on, turn off the light. I mean, you don't have to, but if you turn off the light, what's going to happen? It's going to go dark. Now, leave the light on for 100 hours and then turn it off. Immediately it goes dark. Leave it on for 1,000 hours. Yeah, you guessed it. Still remains dark. In other words, no matter how long the light is on, it's not like the room becomes light because of the light. The light never exists outside the source, which means the moment the source shuts off, there's no light emanating. The source and the ray, let's just use those two terms for simplicity. Source, light bulb, and ray, the light that's here. Yeah, the moment you turn off source, the ray is gone. Unlike the water example that I showed you, right? Where you have source and you have emanation, which can exist. They can exist distinct from each other. When it comes to light, the ray or emanation cannot exist sans source. Correct? You with me on that? By the way, the same experiment you could do with air conditioning. Cucumber lime, interesting. The same thing you can do with air conditioning, right? Imagine a summer day, leave the air conditioner on for 10 hours and shut it off. The room is still cool. But imagine if the air conditioner and the light were on. Turn off the lights and turn off the air conditioner. It's still cool, but now it's pitch dark. Now it's pitch black. So what's the difference? They were both on for 10 hours. Why is it that the cool remains and the light doesn't? It may seem like a silly question, but it's important to think about this. What's the difference? They were both on for 10 hours. Why does one continue to have an effect and one not? Because the light never existed. It's a secret. The source always existed. The light that you thought you saw was nothing other than the source shining. The moment that's done, this is done. When it comes to air conditioning, no, there was a new reality. There's the source, the compressor, condenser. I'm not an AC guy, whatever. That source, and then there's the cool air that's being blown out. Two separate entities. Yes, it came from there, but once it came from there, it's two separate things. Are you with me on this? So yes. Okay, so light is a favorite example used in Kabbalah, favorite expression used in Kabbalah to refer to divine emanation. Anything that comes out of God, we call it light. The Kabbalists call light. Right? There's God, the source, and then there's God's light. So here's what he's saying in chapter 48 at the beginning. God is infinite. Now, what's the definition of infinite? One way to describe infinite or to define infinite as infinite expression. In other words, God is so infinite, there's infinite expression, infinite light that comes out of God. But, or not but, at the same time, the light that emanates from God, he just said in the second line, is always united with God and part of that same source. Just like, frankly, the light in a room is always united with the source. And the greatest proof is because when you shut the source, the light disappears as well, which tells us that they were always connected. Even if it seems like maybe there's two entities, there's a source and then there's a light, Spoiler alert, there's only one entity. It's always united. They're tied to each other. Their fates, well, at least the fate of the light is tied to the fate of the source. Source is gone, light is gone instantly, instantaneously, without any lapse. Make sense? So God is infinite. God is infinite expression. And that infinite expression is ultimately always connected with him. I'm going to share my screen again and pull this back up. So again, first paragraph or first line, well, paragraph line, he says, God is called Ein Sof, which means infinite, which implies that there's no end or limit or finitude at all to the light and vitality that diffuse from his will. So God is infinite, so there's infinite light that comes out of that. And that light is always united with his essence of being in perfect unity. So it's always one with the source. Let's continue. Now, this being the case, something very interesting and important comes up. Okay? And that is, had the worlds descended from the light of the blessed Ein Sof, in other words, had creation emanated or been formed from this infinite light that's purely plugged into the source. Remember, because light and source are united on that level, even on this level, but on that level, they're united also. So had the worlds descended purely from that light, uncut, without contractions meaning tzimtzum, right? If you want to see it in Hebrew, belit tzimtzumim, without, that's plural for contraction. Tzimtzumim, contractions. So had creation descended from that state of infinite light without being cut, without being limited, without the light diminishing, but according rather to a gradual descent from grade to grade by means of cause and effect, then I'm just going to finish the sentence. Actually, he'll finish the sentence. Then this world and all it contains would not have been created in its present form. Had this reality called creation, or had creation emanated without tzimtzum from infinite light, we would not be looking at the worlds, at creation, as it looks today in its present form. The world would not be as it is in a finite and limited order. The world would not be finite. The world would be infinite. If the world emanated from infinite light, it too would be infinite. If it emanated from limitless expression, it would also be limitless. The reason why we have a finite reality, the reason why we have a finite universe, galaxy, right? Even spiritually, as he'll describe soon, there are spiritual limitations as well in the spiritual realms. The reason why we have those limitations is because creation occurs through a process of tzimtzum, of contraction, of concealment, creating limitations to that infinite light and expression. So again, I'm going to reset this. In the beginning, we have the infinite, God. At the same time, we have infinite divine expression. If that were to remain, anything produced from the state of infinity would likewise be infinite. It would not have limitations. In order to go from infinite to finite, it's not reducing it by 1 or 2 or 10. Infinite and finite is a paradigm shift. It's not, you can't reduce infinite. You with me on that? You can't reduce infinite. You can't gradually cut infinite. To go from infinite to finite, which is where we're in, that's the reality that we're in, right? To go from infinite to finite requires drastic measures. And we call that tzimtzum, contraction. Drastic measures to produce a drastic change in reality. Let me share my screen with you. He now supports the notion that we live in a finite reality. And he quotes the Talmud. The Talmud says, and this is Tractate Chagiga 13a, the Talmud says, from the earth to the firmament, right? So from the earth to the firmament would be the heavens. It's a distance of 500 years. That's the way the Talmud expresses how long would it take for you to walk, right, from the earth to the heavens, right? 500 years. The point of that, actually, there's a dual message there. Number one, it's very vast. Wow, 500, it would take 500 years to get, this is before rockets, right? Before spacecraft. So on the one hand, it expresses a very vast distance. On the other hand, it expresses limitation, because after 500 years, you're going to get there, right? In other words, even as vast as it is, it's still limited to a certain degree of vastness and no more than that. And the Talmud also continues to say, similarly, and similarly limited is the distance between one firmament and the next. In Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah, it talks about 7 heavens, 7 different levels of heaven. And it says from the earth to the first to the lowest heaven is 500-year travel. And then from the lowest heaven, number 7 to 6 is 500 years. To 5 is another 5. To heaven 4 is between each level of heaven, there's another 500-year distance, so to speak. It's very vast, it's very large, wonderful, but it's still a limitation. It's not infinite. It's not infinite, right? And so also, he says, the radial extent of each firmament is also a distance of 500 years. So each firmament is 500 years distance, and between one and the other, it's another 500 years. Again, these are all very large measurements, if you think about it, very large expanses, but nonetheless, there is limitation. He continues to say it's not only the physical realm that's limited, the physical galaxy that has limitation, spatial limitation, but it's even the spiritual realms, the spiritual world, so to speak, that have limitation. Let's continue. He says, even the world to come and the higher level of Gan Eden, even Olam Haba, the world to come, and Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, spiritually, right? Which is the abode of the souls of the great tzaddikim. The righteous souls are hanging out there in the highest level of paradise. And even the souls themselves. And needless to say, the angels, all of them, the world to come, the higher level of Gan Eden, paradise, the souls, the angels, all of them are in the realm of bounds and limitation. As lofty as they are, as spiritual as they are, as supernal as they are bound and limited. There is limitation everywhere you look outside of God. So what he's trying to do here is establish a very powerful notion. God is infinite. God's expression, at least initially, is infinite. And then creation unfolds. And as it unfolds in a way of limitation. This world is limited by time and space. Above it, there are also limitations. 500 years, 500 years, 500 years, whatever. It's a distance, it's a limitation. Even the spiritual realms that maybe don't have physical parameters have spiritual parameters of limitation. I want to share with you an insight that's not here, but it's in other places of Kabbalah, in Kabbalah and Chassidut. It talks about the angels. I'll give you an example with the angels. So it says, let me frame it like this. A few weeks ago, there was a Torah portion of Vayera. And in the Torah portion of Vayera, the Torah tells us that it was Abraham 3 days after his circumcision at the age of 99, and he's recovering from the procedure, and 3 angels disguised as men visit him. Why did they visit him? So classic Jewish thought tells us, classic biblical commentaries and the Midrash and the Talmud, everywhere you look, it says the same thing. It says that 3 angels came to visit Abraham. Each one had a task. You see, angels don't multitask. Angels are given one defined task, and that's it. So one angel came to bring healing to Abraham from God, okay? And one angel came to overturn the city of Sodom. And one angel came to bring the good news to Sarah that she was going to have a child. And you might ask, well, why can't one angel do more than one job? And the answer is because the angel Michael, angel Michael, is an angel of kindness. And that angel is not going to overturn a city. It's not going to happen. And the angel Gavriel, which is the angel that overturns the city, is not going to bring healing to Abraham. And the angel that brings healing to Abraham, Raphael, Michal is the one who brought the good news about Sarah. Raphael, the one who brings healing, like Refuah, the healing angel, doesn't overturn or bring good news, just brings healing. So here's the point. Angels, as spiritual as they are, as non-corporeal, they do not have bodies, as they are, they still possess an element of limitation, limited to a certain concept and theme of what they represent. Are you with me on this? Yeah. So, which tells us something important, that something need not have physical parameters to constitute or to possess limitation. There are different forms of limitation, including spiritual limitation or conceptual limitation. Think about a concept in your head. 2 + 2 is 4. That's a concept. Can you touch it? No. I mean, if I gave you two bottles of smart water and added another 2 bottles, and you would have, this class is not sponsored by smart water, although if anybody wants to hook that up, feel free. Okay, so here's the deal. You take 2 bottles and add another 2 bottles. Yeah, so now you have a tangible, limited thing that you can hold. But in your head, 2 + 2 is 4 is not tangible, but it's limited. Why? How do I know this? Because the concept of 2 + 2 is 4 is not the same as the concept that, let me think of another concept. An object that in motion will tend to stay in motion, or an object at rest will tend to stay at rest, right? A physics concept. It's not the same concept. So each one is a concept, each one is true, but it's different. What defines a distinction? I don't know, definition. So a concept also is definition, even though it doesn't have necessarily a space, time and space that limit it. Conceptually, there's also a limitation. Same thing is true with the supernal realms, with spiritual reality. So spiritual created reality, including, we said, Olam Haba, the world to come, including Gan Eden Elyon, the higher Garden of Eden, including the souls of tzaddikim, or souls in general, and the angels, all of them, notwithstanding their loftiness and spiritual heights and greatness and grandeur, they all possess limitation. Remember, our core question is, well, how does limitation arrive from the infinite Ein Sof? The answer to that is tzimtzum, contraction, but that's the arc of our conversation. How do you go from infinite to finite? There has to be something radical in between. All right, so now let me continue sharing my screen with you. So he just established that not only is the physical world and the physical heavens, the firmament, limited, but also the spiritual realms are also limited. And he continues to support this regarding the angels and souls. He says, he gives a different explanation or a different framework here. He says, for there is a limit to their apprehension of the light of the blessed Ein Sof, which shines upon them through being clothed in Chabad and so on. Chabad means Chachma, Bin, and Dat. It's also Chabad, but Chachma, Bin, and Dat, which is the 3 intellectual powers of the soul, of the spirit. So essentially, he says, even the supernal realms and supernal beings are also limited. And he says, how do we see it? I shared with you the distinction between one and another. But he said, even within that spiritual being itself, it's limited insofar as its apprehension, its ability to understand and perceive the light of the infinite light. There's a limit. Each one has its own limit. Each one has its own limit. Hence, he says, that's why there's also a boundary to the enjoyment that they derive from the rays of the divine presence, the Shekhinah, and to their pleasure in the light of God. So even as, let me explain this, even as the souls, let's talk about the souls, above in paradise, spiritual paradise, even as they sit on the soul beach chair and bask in the rays of divine radiance, sounds so nice, right? They bask in the rays of divine radiance. Even as that is happening, there's a limit to what they're getting. There's a limit to what they can perceive. There's a limit to the enjoyment that they can have from that experience. The limit is based on, their enjoyment limit is based on how much they understand. It's almost like an idea that you're learning. So based on your apprehension of the idea, how much you understand it, that will determine your enjoyment of learning that idea, right? If you really understand it, oh, it's geschmack, it's beautiful, oh, it's so sweet. If you didn't understand it, you can't really enjoy it as much, right? So you have 10 people in a class. You have 100 students in a class. It doesn't matter the number, right? And the teacher's teaching, and everyone understands it to one extent or another. The more you understand, the more you'll enjoy. That's pretty much the metric. Assuming that it's enjoyable material, the more you understand it, the more you'll enjoy it. He says it's very similar above with the souls. The souls are experiencing the light and enjoying that experience. But the souls, because they're still created beings, there's a limit to how much they can understand and appreciate. And therefore, there's a boundary to their enjoyment of that light. Simple? Make sense? Yeah. Yeah. For they are incapable of deriving enjoyment and delight, spiritual enjoyment and delight of an infinite order, without being nullified out of their existence and returning to their source. If they were exposed to the full extent of the rays of the infinite light, without tzimtzum, without limitation, if they were to somehow, if their eyes were to be opened so wide that they would see everything, you know what would happen? They would burn out of existence. They could not maintain their identity as a self, being exposed and being aware of the infinite. It's almost like, it's not almost, it's exactly like if you can see the infinite, you would become part of the infinite, right? As God told Moses, when Moses says to God, I want to see you, God says, you cannot see my face and live. What that means is you have a choice. Either you can live or you can see my face, but you can't see my face and live at the same time. If you see my face, face meaning the true essence, then you can't live anymore. In other words, exposed to the truth, to the infinite essence, to the infinite light, there's no way that you can maintain your own self-identity and whatever that self-identity is. This is true for human beings, it's true for souls, it's true for angels, it's true for everything. You cannot see my face and live. You cannot be exposed to the infinite light and still maintain your own identity. Therefore, very importantly, therefore, he says, everything that's created from this physical environment to more spiritual environments, to the most spiritual environments, created environments, are all created with limitation, and the limitation is derived from the light being reduced and being cut. As the light is cut and tzimtzumed, I'm using that not correctly in Hebrew, right? I'm just using it as a verb, I guess. As it's tzimtzumed, as it's limited, self-definition comes into play. Okay, let's continue inside. Or actually, let me check in. Make sense so far? Yes? Okay. So let's continue inside. Okay. Look what he says. So basically, we exist by virtue of tzimtzum. If there was no tzimtzum, we limited beings would not exist. It would just be infinite. Again, if infinite is never cut, it's just infinite, and then you don't have finite beings, physical or spiritual. Now, he says, as for the intricate details of these contractions, how they achieve their effect and what they actually are, he says, this is not the place for that explanation. He says, if you want to know more about tzimtzum, not right now. He's trying to bring out a point that there is tzimtzum, right? That the infinite light is cut to create and produce a finite reality. If you want to know what's a tzimtzum, how's it tzimtzum, Where's a Simpson? All right, you got to look that up in the encyclopedia, the Kabbalah encyclopedia, and explore you could do a deep dive and research on Simpson. I'm going to fill in a little bit of details, but clearly the author, the Alter Rebbe, is looking to make a point and continue the point and not get bogged down in those details. I'm going to give you a little bit. Oh, you know what? He does. He gives a general explanation. He says, but so the intricacies, here we go. Yeah, the intricate details are not for now. But in general, what's Tzimtzum? What are Tzimtzumim? What are these contractions? In general, they are something in the nature of an obscuring and concealment of the flow of light and vitality. So what's a Tzimtzum? Generally speaking, it's something that obscures and conceals the flow of light, the flow of infinite light, and vitality. So that, and what's the purpose of Tzimtzum? What's the purpose of these concealments and these obscurings and concealments? What's the point? So that the light and vitality should illumine and reach the lower creatures in a revealed manner, pervading them and acting in them and animating them in such a way that they exist ex nihilo, which means something from nothing, and only in extremely minute measure, so that they can be in a state of finitude and limitation. Basically, he's saying, what is Tzimtzum and what's its purpose? Tzimtzum is the obscuring and concealment of the light. And what's the purpose? So that the light can flow into a limited being and illuminate it and animate it and give it life so that it can exist on its terms. I'm going to give you the example that I always give, because this is the classic example in Kabbalah. It's about light and vessel. And you probably heard me, for those of you that have taken a few classes with me, you probably heard me say this countless times. There's light and there's vessel. We're talking about light tonight, right? But you also have to think about vessel. If your light is too big for the vessel, it's going to damage the vessel. The vessel's going to explode. So if you want the light to fit into the vessel, it's got to be limited to fit into the size of the vessel. So think about it. Think about a blade of grass. One blade of grass growing in your front lawn. One blade of grass. It grows. That's magic. So in Kabbalah and Judaism, we say there's no magic. There's nothing called nature. Nature is nothing but a term that we use to avoid saying God, right? Or for whatever reason, right? So you don't want to say God, so we call it nature. It is what it is. But nature is nothing other than God. So, which means that right now, that blade of grass that's growing, that's alive, it has a soul. It has a divine life force in it. Infinite? No. If there was infinite life force, it would blow up the blade of grass. It would be like a short circuit, right? It would it's like plugging in your 110, 120 appliance into a 220, 240 outlet, right? You're going to see smoke coming out of that thing. So what has to happen for the blade of grass to effectively be enlivened by the divine life force? That infinite light has to get cut and cut and cut. I'm backing up in my chair. And cut and cut and cut and cut until the light is so reduced that it can fit into the blade of grass. And I know this sounds like an oversimplification, but he said this is generally what's going on. Without getting into the details of exactly how Tzimtzum works, this is one way to conceptualize it, and it's not incorrect. The big infinite light, to fit into finite reality, has to be cut and cut and cut and lessened and lessened and lessened. It's no different than a teacher who's trying to take a big concept and teach it in a way that's understandable to young children. Take the big idea and you cut it 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 and you repackage it, right? To the point where it has the core idea, but it's not so lofty. It's reduced. It's reduced to the point where it can fit into the mind of the young, curious student. That's the role of Tzimtzum. The cool thing about Simpson is that it not only animates the blade of grass once it's there. In other words, it's not just that it cuts the light to fit into the existing blade of grass. Tzimtzum allows for the blade of grass to be created in the first place. Are you with me in the distinction? It's not like you had a blade of grass, but you have to get it into the blade of grass. So you got to reduce it down and then like inject a little bit of light into the blade of grass. That's also true. But how do you get the blade of grass in the first place? How do you go from infinite energy to one defined blade of grass? Again, the answer is Tzimtzum. So Tzimtzum both creates and animates at the same time. Yeah, and again, these concepts are elaborated in other places in Kabbalah and Hasidic philosophy, but nonetheless, this is the core idea as explained over here. All right. Here we go. This light and vitality that is revealed within them. So imagine, and I gave you the example of the blade of grass. Imagine the light, the divine energy, the divine life force, the soul inside one blade of grass. So that light, after that contraction, constitutes an infinitesimal illumination, right? It's a minute, right? The word infinitesimal. Why is it so weird for me to pronounce it? Anyway, it sounds weird as I'm saying it, but this minute, tiny amount of illumination is what's going into this blade of grass, into this one creation. And it is truly considered as naught. It's like nothing when compared to the quality of the limitless and infinite illumination. In other words, compare the light, the divine light and life force in the blade of grass to the infinite light before the Tzimtzum. Go compare. You can't compare the two. It's like it's infinitely distinct. And there is no reference or relationship between them. You cannot at all compare the infinite light to the post-Tzimtzum reduced, cut 1,000 times, because there's more than one Tzimtzum. All of those almost infinite number of Tzimtzumim, that are cutting the light again and again and again and again and again and chopping it this way and that way and the other until it's enough, small enough, and limited enough to specifically enliven a blade of grass to only do what blades of grass do, right? That light doesn't make the blade of grass talk. It makes it only do what it needs to do. So it's reduced in its power and its potency and its size and its form to fit specifically the blade of grass. Compare that light to how it started in an infinite level. There's no relationship between the two. Two different realities. In other words, and here I'm going to read this. I'm going to read the explanation. In other words, they are not quantitatively different. It's not like big and small, not even immensely different in quantity, but of a wholly different and incomparable quality. It's not quantitatively different. It's qualitatively different. The difference between infinite and non-infinite is not numbers. It's a quality. It's a different quality. It's not quantity. As the term reference, he says, you can't say that there's some sort of reference between the two, because the term reference is understood in number values, quantity, where the number one, for example, has a relevancy to the number 1 million, for it's 1/1,000,000th a part of it. It's a 1/1,000,000th part of it. And he's going to explain what he means, but let's jump right into it. He says, think about two numbers, 1,000,000 and 1. Are they vastly different? Yes. Is one very far from 1,000,000? Yes. But is there a reference? Is there a frame of reference between the two? Is there a relativity between the two? Yes. They're both numbers. And 1 1,000,000 times will get you 1,000,000. It's 1/1,000,000th. Or it's 1/1,000,000th of 1,000,000. That's when you're talking about two numbers. But as regards a thing which transcends finitude and numeration, but talk about infinity. Talk about 1 to infinity, not to 1,000,000, or even talk about 1,000,000 to infinity. When you talk about something that transcends numbers, there is no number. There is no number, however great, that can be relative to it. For 1,000,000,000 and 1,000,000,000,000, when compared to infinity, do not even attain the relevancy of the value of 1 in comparison with 1,000,000,000 or 1,000,000,000,000. He says here, I'm going to form it as a question. I want to see you guys as I ask this question. Which is closer? 1 to a trillion or a trillion to infinite? Which is closer? 1 to a trillion, right? Because they're both numbers. Even a trillion to infinite, there's no comparison. Because a trillion times a trillion times another trillion, you'll never get to infinity. Infinity is something completely beyond measure. So every time you're dealing with numbered finite units, no matter how big or small, you're dealing with two things in the same sandbox. 1 and 1,000 are in the same playing field. 1 in a million, same playing field. 1 in a trillion, same playing field. But a trillion and infinite, it's a different reality. It's a different quality. So here's what he's saying. The pre-Simpson light, the original infinite light, yeah, it's infinite. And then it's cut again and again. Simpson, concealment, contraction, hiding, to the point that you get a finite light. How that works, again, he says, you can't get into the details right now. We've discussed in other classes, Sunday mornings, Kabbalah and Coffee. We've done deep dives into Simpson in the past, but not for right now. But what happens? What happens is you go from infinite light to finite light. Somehow, magically, you go from infinite to finite, right? And now you have finite light of varying degrees, because the finite light in the realm where the souls are hanging out is bigger light than the finite light in a blade of grass. But nonetheless, those two are relative to each other. Oh, hey, how's it going, bud? Right? Those two, hey, Ellie, say hi. Those two have a certain degree, look, Baba, those two have a certain degree of relativity to each other, right? The blade of grass is one blade of grass relative to Gan Eden, to the paradise. But you know what? They're both produced by post-Simpson limited light. So it's like 1 in a trillion. But you know what? 1 in a trillion, still relative. But you talk about Gan Eden, paradise, to Ein Sof, to the infinite, original infinite light, no comparison. Make sense? Yes? Sort of? Yes? Okay, good. Adina Malka, no? No? Yes? All right. Okay. You're saying keep on going. All right. I'm getting the green light. So let me jump back in. And he says, he concludes this thought by saying, right? So 1 to a million is relative, but a million or a trillion or a billion, whatever, to infinite, there's no relevancy. It's not even in the same ballpark. He says, rather, but it is veritably accounted as nothing. In other words, relative to infinity, the billion, the trillion, it's all garnished. It's all nothing. It doesn't, I don't even know how to describe it. It doesn't take up any space. It doesn't have any value relative to infinity. So now that we've talked about numbers, let's bring it back to divine light. He says, so indeed is the utterly insignificant quality of this minute illumination after the contraction, which clothes itself in the higher worlds and the lower worlds in order to provide them with sustenance in life, when compared with the quality of the hidden and concealed light that is of an infinite order. So what he's saying here is, just like a trillion to infinite is nothing, so too is post-Simpson light, post-contraction light, relative to pre-Simpson infinite light. Post-Simpson light is finite, and pre-Simpson light is infinite. Those two are incomparable to each other. And this light does not clothe itself or exercise its influence in the worlds in a revealed manner, providing them with life, but rather encompasses them from above, i.e., it exerts its influence while remaining on its own level, and it's called Sovev Kol Almin, the level that encompasses the worlds. Okay, so this is a new concept, which we're going to pick up next week, because we're at the time now, it's 9 o'clock. But here's what he's saying. Remember I gave you the example of the blade of grass? The blade of grass needs an injection of light and energy and life force to keep it going. It needs a soul, but that soul has to be really small to fit in, so to speak, to the blade of grass. That's because it has to fit into the blade of grass. But what if somehow it could be powered by a force that transcends it? Well, that's another form of divine energy that doesn't have to be cut or limited to fit into a particular item. It can exert influence on a higher level from outside and not necessarily go inside. So to understand the dual influence of an inner influence and an outer influence, so for that we have to wait till next week. So what did we learn tonight? That's my little teaser trailer for next week. So what did we learn tonight? In summation, what we learned is that God is called the Ein Sof. God is called infinite. And just like God's infinite, just like God is infinite, so too God's light and emanation is likewise infinite. And that provides a big challenge, because how do you create finite reality from an infinite source, from infinite light? And the only answer is what Kabbalah tells us, and that is that the infinite light undergoes a process called Simpson, which radically changes the light from infinite to finite. Excuse me, and reduces it step by step, degree by degree, until the point where the light descends so far and becomes so limited that it can produce our physical created reality. Even the higher created realities are also created and also have limitation. But the more you go down, the further you go in this, it's called Seder Hishtashalut, this order of creation, the lower the light needs to be, the more filtered the light needs to be. And where he's going with this, just to give you the bigger picture, and especially in reference to how I started the beginning of the class. Remember we spoke about the meditation when you realize how much the king did for you, came down to the dung heap to pick you up? Think about what we're saying now. God cut his light again and again and again and again. Why? To create you. God reduced himself again and again and again and again to give you life, to give you vitality, to give you your own soul, to give you your own identity. God loves you so much, he's willing to cut himself, so to speak, to cut his own light, to reduce himself, to change from infinite to finite, just to create you. That's powerful. That's powerful. Imagine Einstein takes the time to speak to a small child, right? A 6-year-old child. We have a 6-year-old, right? Are you 6?
No.
How old are you?
5.
5.
5.
I think you're 6. So imagine we have, imagine Einstein, so brilliant, takes the time and the attention and bends down and sees the child, bends down and says, let me tell you a story. And he takes the time to take a brilliant concept and reduce it, cut it down. It's an act of love. It's an act of love because he cares about the child. To take something big that otherwise wouldn't fit in the brain of the child, in the mind of the child at that stage. And he takes the time, even though it's a process. And what does he need it for? But he does it. That's an act of love. So here's the meditation for this week. God is infinite. And on God's terms, everything that comes out of that is infinite. So how are we here? Because God cares enough about us to put himself through the process of tzimtzum. I'm not suggesting that it hurts God, so to speak, to contract himself, but it's still a process. And why did he do it? So you and I can exist. So you and I can have our own reality and enjoy and live life as we are living. So that's the meditation. And the bottom line of the meditation is, right, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is God loves us, and God gives to us, and God blesses us. And God goes from infinite to finite just for us. All right, and knowing that, knowing how much God loves us, we'll be inspired also with love for God as well. All right, thank you all for joining. Feel free to unmute and ask a question or final comments. Feel free to mention anything or anything that comes to mind. Ellie, any final comments? Just like smiling into the camera. All right. I love your smile, big guy. Okay. Questions, comments?
Good class.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. And by the way, Steve, hold up your book because Steve is rocking the lessons in Tanya that we're using. That's the book. So you can look it online, but that's the book, the way it looks. That's one version. I have another version, same book, Lessons in Tanya, just a different edition of it. So if you'd like to hold on to it, you can certainly take a look and find it. I'm sure you can buy it online or in the local Judaica store, etc. It is available for your benefit.
Judaica Corner.
Say it again.
Judaica Corner.
Yes, Judaica Corner. Yeah, our local Judaica store. It's important to support local businesses, especially in times like these. So don't forget, I'm joking. Don't forget Torah. Smart water is Torah. Torah is compared to water. So that's the real smart water. It'll make you smart. Thanks for joining me tonight for Tanya, Think Different. We'll see you all next week. Same bad time, same bad channel. And I'm sure I'll see you before then. All right, everybody. Have a good night. And
Hi, Ellie.
Take care. Ellie, say hi to Baba.
Hi, Ellie.
Ellie, say hi. He's saying hi in his heart. All right. We'll see y'all. Have a wonderful evening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Take care, everybody.
Thank you very
Hi,
much.
everybody.
Thank you.
Hi,
Bye.
everybody.
Pleasure.
Bye.